Hello history fans and welcome back to Random History Facts to fall asleep to. I finally made enough TikToks to make another full YouTube episode for you. Woohoo! Let's all celebrate by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, yeah? Cool, thanks. Let's just get on with it. My laptop is just below you guys, so it's gonna look like I'm not looking at you, but I figured that was okay because you'll probably be asleep soon. Hopefully, anyway. The earliest archaeological evidence for skincare comes from ancient Egypt 6,000 years ago. Castor and moringa oil were used to stop wrinkles. Clay was used to cleanse, and Dead Sea salt to exfoliate. Ancient Greeks used honey and olive oil as a wrinkle-preventing, skin-smoothing face mask. And the Vikings used coal to protect their eyes from the sun. In Tudor times, they used white lead and sometimes mercury to cover spots or blemishes. Elizabeth I had smallpox scars that were so bad, so then she layered on thicker and thicker makeup that was literally corroding her skin and killing her. Women in Tudor court left thick layers of makeup on their face for a week before it would be washed off to reveal the skin underneath was grey and wrinkly, so more would be caked back on. The Victorians had the first commercial cosmetic products that weren't just home remedies, and Vaseline was created, and fresh petals would be added to it to make a lip gloss or blush, or rather they called it a rouge. Unibrows were popular in the Roman times, so women would fill them in the middle, or even sometimes they would stick hairs on. Apparently they'd also do that in Greece. And the eyebrows were the least natural part of their look. They used olive oil and charcoal to make eyebrows darker, and their eyes as well. But in the Elizabethan Tudor age, women plucked their eyebrows to give them an illusion of a big forehead. I don't think that's Elizabethan. I think that was medieval. Why am I fact-checking myself right now? Ancient Egyptians used kohl around their eyes, usually made from galena, which is a grey ore, and they actually saw makeup as a source of personal power. They thought eye makeup protected them from the evil eye. Queen Victoria said that makeup was vulgar and unladylike, so wearing makeup was frowned upon, or considered just for prostitutes. So women would pinch their cheeks and bite their lips for a rosy, natural look. And those kind of ideas that Victoria started can still be seen trickling down today. So, that wasn't very feminist of you, was it, Victoria? She wasn't, anyway. Luckily, though, in the 1920s, with Hollywood movie stars, women were encouraged to wear makeup again, and the makeup industry boomed, with trends coming back too, like red lipstick. In the 50s was a powerful feminine symbol, but also during the Second World War. Stone Age people are said to have killed bears, ripped open their stomachs and eaten the meat the bear had just eaten. In the 18th century, it was common to cut the gums of your baby to stop teething, because they thought it was safer than letting teeth break through naturally, as teething was thought to cause seizures and various other random illnesses. Making matches in factories was done by girls who would dip the wooden sticks into the phosphorus solution, which was fine for a few years, but eventually you would develop phossy jaw, where the phosphorus caused your gums to abscess, you had a gross discharge, and eventually an eerie glow, and the only way out of it was removing the jawbone. When Richard the Lionheart captured Cyprus, he made all the men shave their beards off. Poems in the 1700s reference the fact that women would trap mice and then stick the skin and the fur to their face to replace shaved off eyebrows. In 1780, the chainsaw was invented to cut through the pelvic bone more efficiently to save dying mothers from very long, dangerous procedures or labour, where the bone was previously cut with a tiny knife. In ancient Rome, there were vomit collectors who, as you would assume, had to clean all the vomit after a feast. A cook of Henry VIII was boiled to death because he accidentally poisoned soup. Or maybe was the tester just allergic to something? In the Roman times, you might dye your hair with a mixture of leeches and vinegar that was pickled for 40 days, but then would probably poison you. Shards of broken pottery were used by the poorer Romans as loo roll, and in the 17th century, to make thicker violin strands, sheep innards were intertwined with the string. So string makers had to really carefully kill sheep so as to not rupture the tissue they needed. Ancient Egyptians would kill a mouse and put it into their mouth if they had toothache. In Victorian cities, bone grubbers would take rotting bones from butchers, rubbish and stockyards and sell them on to dealers who would sell them on to be made into various things like toothbrushes, teething rings or soap. The year 69 was the disaster year of the 4 emperors of Rome. The first civil war of the Roman Empire marked a transition from the first set of emperors, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, to the new Flavian dynasty. Emperor Nero died without an heir, so military legions then fought for who the next emperor of Rome should be. First came Galba, who was governor of Hispania. And he was proclaimed emperor by his legion in April. So when Nero himself in June of 68, Galba was then emperor because he's been proclaimed it by his legion. He had a few months until Otto, who thought he would have been adopted as heir but wasn't, he came along and decided to kill Galba in January 69 with the help of the Praetorian Guard. So he is now emperor. He was popular, but Vitellius's legions had said he should be emperor at the same time, so they went too, with Vitellius, and defeated Otto in the first battle in April 69. So he was now emperor. He didn't have much support outside of his one German legion though, so in comes Vespasian. He was acclaimed in July and gained the support that Galba and Otto had had before, so he sent his legions in to fight. They came from the Danube, so they defeated Vitellius relatively quickly in October, but he wasn't killed until December, so Vespasian only just makes it into the year 69, and he then brings in the new era of emperors and kind of solves things from the year 70, but I'm pretty sure the Roman historian Tacitus was asked to write his histories by them, so that version of the ideas might be distorted. Just like the fact that Henry VIII commissioned the guy to write that Richard III was evil to cement his reign. What happened in the year 24 through time? Let me tell you. In 24 BCE, Augustus became Roman consul for the 10th time, and he founded the city of Necropolis in Egypt, marking his final victory over Mark Antony. In 24 CE, the Senate expelled actors from Rome. In 1024, it's auto-corrected to Mango era. So I'm not sure that's the actual name, but an era in Japan begins, and the Cairo Canal is opened in Egypt. In 1124, Henry I defeats some Norman rebels, and David I becomes King of Scotland. In 1224, King Louis VIII of France declared war on Henry III of England, and the University of Naples was founded. In 1324, Mansa Musa embarked on a religious pilgrimage to Mecca with 8,000 courtiers and 12,000 servants. And the Queen of France, Marie of Luxembourg, died of her injuries after falling from a carriage. She fell and went into labour, giving birth to a premature daughter who also died shortly after. 1424 are the wars in Lombardy, and King James I of Scotland was released from captivity in England after 18 years. In 1524, Marseille in France is besieged by the Holy Roman Empire, and Anne Boleyn is mixing things up in England, I think. Actually, she's already been here 2 years. 1624, England declares war on Spain, and Norway makes it illegal for Jesuit or Roman Catholic monks to be harboured in their country. In 1724, the Treaty of Constantinople is signed, and Catherine I of Russia is officially named Karina by her husband Peter the Great. I think that's supposed to be their version of a queen. In 1824, William Buckland named the Megalosaurus the first scientifically valid-named non-avian dinosaur. That's very specific. In 1924, we have the first ever Labour Prime Minister. Greece is proclaimed a republic, and the first Winter Olympics happened. Of course, there's loads of other things too. 536 was the worst year in history, but of course there's other good contenders. So in 536, there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland that spread ash so badly it blocked out the sun for over a year, for 18 months. Europe and the Middle East and some of Asia were just in constant darkness. The next 10 years were pretty rough, with more eruptions, and then the coldest decade ever, and the first plague pandemic that helps with the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, when we have the Black Death in 1347 to 49, you could argue they're pretty bad years. 1816 was the year without summer, where, like in 536, a volcano erupted and ash covered the sky. But this one from Mount Tambor is in Indonesia, and it was the most powerful volcanic eruption ever in recorded human history. The eruption caused cold temperatures that caused worldwide famine, until the next year as well as a typhus epidemic. Some say that was the year of the coming of the apocalypse. Or some say 1918 was the worst year, with things like the Second Battle of the Somme and then the Spanish flu, or 1943 with Stalingrad and the Holocaust, but also famine and disease in India. There's quite a lot of bad years, but I feel like to be in darkness for a whole year in 536, pretty bad. In the 19th century, menstruation was thought to cause hysteria and madness. Medical texts written by leading medical professionals said that periods were making women mad and violent. They say incoherent things, they roar, they scream, they shriek, they moan. All due to menstruation, according to Dr. William Rowley in his text, Passio Hysterica. Menstruation was dangerous because it caused hysteria, had something superstitious and weird to do with the moon. It weakened bodies, and it made women more prone than men to commit unusual or outrageous acts, according to Dr. Jacobi in 1868. But it was John Burns in his The Principles of Midwifery in 1811 who wrote that menstruation was to be considered a disease. Not only a disease, but a danger. Basically what I'm trying to tell you is there was no reason doctors were taught this, other than ignorance of men in the medical profession trying to control women's bodies and make us out to be insane. In the 1800s, the rich held mummy unwrapping parties, where guests would watch the process and take pieces home as souvenirs. During the bubonic plague, people thought bad smells caused disease. So, to combat this miasma, people carried around pomanders, which were scented balls of herbs and spices. But of course the rats and fleas were thriving in these unsanitary conditions of life. In 1886, Sawdust Jack ended up racing James Gordon across the country with a wheelbarrow. It started in Newcastle, where John Martin, Sawdust Jack, was trying to push through his crowd of supporters as he began his race to London, saying he'd cover 30 miles a day with his wheelbarrow. Overtaking James, Jack actually gave up 4 days later because people were supporting James, who was miles ahead, making it from Dundee to London quicker and becoming a hero in the papers. In 1858, the Thames stank so much that Parliament suspended its meetings. To stop the smell, they had to build a proper sewage system, which eventually led to public health reforms. Apparently King Louis XIV of France did really smelly farts, so he enjoyed using perfumes, really smelly perfumes, to cover it up. So you would have smelt him coming either way. The Victorians thought that bathing too often could make you ill, so instead they used perfumes and powders to cover up. So you'd probably smell them too. Oh, and then I've gone back to the Thames. So in 1858, it was so full of human waste, dead animals, and industrial waste, among other gross things. So then a particularly hot summer of 1858 meant the river dropped, leaving sewage on the banks, that then baked in the sun and increased the smell, making it so bad that people threw up if they got too close. And it was thought to be the cause of disease, since 3 outbreaks of cholera had happened just before. Bloodletting with leeches and animal dung was used as, soothing creams before germ theory was a thing, or understood, rather. Through time, toothpaste has been made of various things, like ancient Egyptians made it from burnt eggshells, Romans crushed bones or seashells, or the 1800s used soap or chalk. The corpse flower was famous for its smell of rotting flesh and became a popular, if not gross, attraction at the Victorian Botanical Gardens. Called Titan arum, it can grow to 12 feet tall with a central spike in the flower. And yes, it smells like rotting meat, or like your food bin, blooming for just 24 hours every 2 to 3 years. So I suppose that really was a marvel. Supposedly, Henry VIII covered Catherine Howard's body in lime when she was buried so that it disintegrated quicker. In 1819, men had grown bored of riding horses and began riding the dandy horse, like a hobby horse or a little bike without pedals, with the Prince Regent, later George IV, supposedly having 4, although maybe not because he was young and cool, but actually because he was so overweight at that point that he needed it to get around. According to late Anglo-Saxon chronicles, vampires were rife in England. In one village, it said that 2 peasants had died, but they were seen wandering around with their coffins on their back, knocking on people's doors, and whoever's name they called out soon got very ill and sometimes died. So the villagers opened up their graves, found the corpses not really decayed, and clots over their faces with blood. So naturally, they cut off their heads, put them between their legs, and cut out their hearts and burned them. The sensible way to be rid of a vampire. It's said that 2 black birds flew up from the fire, and vampires were never seen again, and the poorly people recovered. This story was recorded in the 1190s by William of Newburgh, and he said that seeing these walking deads was so common, it was sort of boring to write about, as there were so many tales of zombies in amongst the vampires. The first female doctor known by name in history is Merit Ptah, possibly not pronounced like that, Ptah, from around 2700 BCE. Her name is in hieroglyphs in a tomb that describes her as chief physician. In the 1800s, strangely, the aristocracy took up making their own shoes for fun. In 1929, in the Sussex County magazine, a story called The Dragon of Nucker Hole was published. Part of folklore for a while before then, it's become one of the many British culture's dragon tales. It said there was a huge dragon living in a pool near Leominster, eating cows and women. Jim Puttock decided to deal with it and took the dragon a huge suet pudding, so the dragon eats it all, including Jim's horse and cart, and then demands more. So Jim brings an even bigger one, to which the story says the dragon gets the collywobbles, and then pretending to offer the dragon medicine, Jim gets close and hits it on the head with an axe. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, or the Philosopher King, was the last of the line of emperors known as Rome's 5 good emperors that were part of the Nerva Antonine dynasty. He's famous because of his Stoic philosophy, with things like, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts," or, "When you arise in the morning, Think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. He was a beloved and wise emperor, but rather than being killed by his evil son, like in the film Gladiator, he's said to have died from the Antonine Plague that swept Europe. When he died, it's suspicious though, as his son was there and immediately signed a peace treaty to end the war his father had been fighting, rather than finishing the fight, and then zooms back off to Rome to be a gladiator. All a bit strange. When Marcus Aurelius dies, his son Caracalla became emperor, but he just appoints 2 friends, or slaves, to run the empire, so he could train to fight as a gladiator. And just to point out, that's ridiculous, as slaves were killed in the fights for entertainment, so why on earth the emperor wants to do it, or stoop so low, is mad to most people, and he basically bankrupts Rome with his constant games. I've just realised I said Caracalla, but it's Commodus. Marcus Aurelius' son is Commodus. I'm talking about Commodus, not Caracalla, sorry. He would give his opponents dull swords and mostly enjoyed fighting animals, although his human opponents that he picked were often people that he knew wouldn't really have much of a fight in them. Women, disabled people, mentally ill people, the ones he could easily kill and really make suffer. He obviously gave himself a massive salary for his appearances, and he would usually come out dressed as Mercury, shoot the animals with a bow and arrow, or he'd come out as Hercules in god form, claiming to be his descendant, wearing the lion skin and carrying a club. Changed the name of Rome to Colonia Commodonia, the colony of Commodus. The Senate became the Commodian Fortunate Senate, and the people Commodianus. And he renames the months of the year after his different titles. So, a little bit demanding. He even declared himself the new Romulus, the new founder of Rome. There's many controversies, and he leaves a list of people he wants to kill on his desk, and his mistress finds it. And it includes her, his trainer, and some senators who decide to kill him instead. And so, after being Caesar, emperor, for 12 years, he's killed in his bath by Narcissus. To follow, in 193, would be the year of the 5 emperors, with huge power struggles. So while Rome was safe from one tyrant, it's not going to go well for them now either. In ancient Egypt, there was a disease caused by a parasitic worm that made men bleed out of their apparently, and it was so common that people thought it was just part of growing up. Honestly, I don't know where that comes from though. The Romans used urine to wash their clothes and their teeth, which worked because of the ammonia, but they didn't know that. Heperiotiko was the 1700s term for an entertainer who would fart as his act. Some were jesters in the royal court, like Roland the Farter. He was actually pretty famous and became quite rich after being named as the favourite of the King Henry II. And Le Petomane was a famous Frenchman who would play the national anthem by farting. Henry VIII's favourite jester, though, was said to be William Somers, who was the only one who could cheer him up in his later life when he was really suffering. But he was also liked by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's minister, as he would joke about things like waste or unnecessary extravagance in the royal household. So Thomas could use him and his jokes to subconsciously bring things to Henry's attention. Subconsciously, discreetly, in a silly way that wouldn't anger him. Queen Maria, Charles I's wife, liked Sir Geoffrey Hudson, or Lord Minimus, who was hidden in a pie before bursting out at the opportune moment, as her first impression of him, and he was kept by her as another rarity of nature that she liked to keep, and ended up doing skits with William Evans, who was a huge Welshman, where he would pull Geoffrey and some bread out of his pocket and make a sandwich. Edmund Ironside was so impressed with his jester Hittard that he awarded him the Lordship of Walworth. We've now got a year 25 through time. In 325 BCE, Alexander the Great's army fought the Malians. In 225 BCE, the Gauls defended the Romans at the Battle of Fæculae, but later in that year, the Romans then won the battle against them at Telamon. In 25 BCE, Augustus or Octavian became Roman consul for the 9th time, and Rome had become the largest city in the world. In the year 25, the Han dynasty was restored in China. 125, Emperor Hadrian builds the Pantheon. 425, there was a short Roman civil war between the West Roman Emperor and the East Roman Emperor. In 525, Dionysius Exiguus, a monk, created the BC AD system, believing this was the first year after the birth of Jesus. 825, there was a battle between the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, which Wessex won, becoming the dominant power in Europe. In 1025, Poland crowned its first king. In 1225, King Henry III issued a new version of the Magna Carta after King John, who signed the original, died. In 1325, Edward II's wife Isabella left for France and remained there with her new lover Roger Mortimer, before returning the next year to make Edward III, his son, king. 1625, Charles I became king, and in 1925, Mussolini declared himself dictator in Italy. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and Earl Wise invented the potato chip, and Charles Jenkins the first television set. Spiders are called arachnids because of the Greek goddess Athena, and Orion is a constellation in the sky because of Artemis. Pandora, the jewellery brand, took its name from the first mortal woman in Greek mythology. Well, I don't know if they took their name from it, but if they did, she was a woman who was given a box, told not to open it, but did, and released all the bad things into the world. Hermes, the delivery company, although they're not called that anymore, but Hermes was the messenger of the Greek gods. Dove, the beauty brand. A dove was a symbol of Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty. Loads of sports clubs and teams, like the Titans. But Athena had a competition with a woman who said she was a better weaver than her, but she lost and was turned into a spider, being told that the rest of her lineage would forever be weavers, and her name was Arachne. And Orion was one of Artemis's lovers, who died. You've probably drank the same water as a dinosaur, Cleopatra, or Henry VIII, molecularly speaking. Victorian hair jewellery was common to just use the hair of a dead loved one into a locket or a brooch or a ring. In the 1880s, the French scientist Louis Pasteur made the connection between transferring microbes and the spread of disease, creating this public health movement where people started to wash their hands properly. And after the Industrial Revolution, mass-scale production of soap became possible, so big brands start to appear, like Pears in 1886. And there was also medical or antiseptic soaps as well. That's what carbolic soap was advertised as. And Plymouth was the centre of soap making. Then I've got 10 facts from ancient Greece. They invented the yo-yo. There's a similar looking toy found from 500 BCE. They didn't eat beans because they thought they contained the souls of the dead. The marathon came from ancient Greece after Philippides ran 26 miles from Marathon to Athens to announce the news of victory in battle. They would add water to their wine so they didn't become drunk, because only a barbarian would do that. They invented theatre, but it would be just men on stage wearing different masks. Stones, pebbles or broken ceramics were used as toilet roll. They invented cheesecake as well. So that made me look a bit less blinding. Hair was a symbol of your manhood and intelligence. It gave you the power for your journey to the underworlds. That's why cowards were punished in Sparta by shaving their heads. The Romans copied their mythology essentially, and unibrows were fashionable for women. 1066 and 1666 are like ingrained in every English person's memory from school, right? But why? Were there other interesting 66s in history? Well, on the 14th of October 1066 was the Battle of Hastings, where William of Normandy, or William the Conqueror, defeated King Harold, changing England forever, because the Anglo-Saxon king was replaced by a Norman one who brought in new culture, political ideas and language. In 1666, personally I think is more interesting because it's the Great Fire of London. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. It lasted for several days, and even King Charles II is said to have helped by giving money to firefighters, bringing bread to those who lost their houses, and he organised a national fundraiser. And after London was rebuilt with wider streets and safety measures. In the year 66, the first Jewish revolt against the Roman rule in Judea started. In 166, a plague broke out in the Roman Empire. In 666, Chertsey and Barking Abbey were built. In 866, the Vikings invaded York and established their kingdom in Northumbria. 1266 was the siege of Kenilworth Castle. 1866, MPs presented the first mass women's suffrage petition to the House of Commons. And in 1966, we won the World Cup. It's actually illegal to be drunk in a pub in England because the Licensing Act of 1872 says you can only be drunk on your own property. The longest diplomatic alliance in history is between England and Portugal, signed first in 1373. French was this country's language for like 300 years after William the Conqueror became king, and it lasted until 1362. But it wasn't really the country's language because it was only spoken by nobles anyway. Since 1826, there's been an annual cheese rolling contest in Gloucester. In the 1660s, Christopher Merritt added fizz to wine, inventing sparkling wine. In the Cotswolds, 30 years before the French monk Dom Perignon invented it in Champagne. In 1814, there was the London beer flood when a wooden vat of beer burst open at a brewery. It sent beer all over the streets of London, but flooded the streets of St Giles Rookery, which is when there's like a dense area of housing and population, typically a slum, and being a slum, largely populated, and it killed at least 8 people. Real names of Victorian children were Leicester Railway, One Too Many and Friendless. In 1875, a suggested way to fight off pneumonia was to cover yourself in newspaper to keep you warm at night. Arsenic, the poison, was in soap, wallpaper, food and clothes in the Victorian era. Despite wearing black for years after her husband's death, Queen Victoria didn't like black at funerals and had hers be white and purple. And apparently in the Victorian times it was poor taste for people to visit you before 3 p.m, but the closer you were, the later they could visit. The saying old codger comes from medieval times, so on a hunt the king would bring birds to hunt, and they were carried in a wooden frame called a codge, and the old trustworthy servant would be the man to carry the codge, and they'd be called codgers. So being old, that's where we then get old codgers. We only had forks from like the 1500s. Before that, it was just spoons and knives and yans. But when forks were first brought to Italy, I think the Pope banned them because they resembled the devil. They were the symbol of the devil. After a battle, women would be sent to count the dead bodies in medieval times, but they're quite heavy, so they would chop off a hand and put it in their bag to take to count at the end altogether. The Secret Service began in the 1500s when Henry VIII sent men to other great courts of Europe to spy on their rulers, and they mostly went as painters to paint the other nobles, but they would hide secret messages in the objects of their paintings. The Celts were a group of people, or rather it's the name of a group of different tribes of people in Europe from maybe as early as the 12,000s BCE. They have similar cultures and traditions, which is why they're together, despite being different tribes. They're first documented in the 8th century, when the Roman Empire ruled most of the places they were, so they wrote about the barbarians or the Galli, meaning first time we have something written about them was from the Romans, because the Celts themselves were an oral society. The Erfurt latrine disaster in 1184 was a meeting of nobles gathered in the ancient church in Erfurt, including the German king Henry VI, and the floor beneath them gave way and they fell into the cesspit below. A lot of them drowned in excrement, but others were just injured in the fall. Godfrey the Hunchback, or the Duke of Lower Lorraine, was assassinated in 1076 after he was using the toilet and someone used a sword or some sort of sharp weapon because the medieval buildings' toilets were just sort of open, hanging over the side. But it actually took him a few days to die from internal bleeding. Toilets in Roman times were communal. Why do we all know the story of Guy Fawkes from our schooling in England? Well, the Tudor period had a lot of drama, but a big one was Henry VIII splitting from England and the Catholic Church. Splitting England from the Catholic Church. He created a new version of Christianity, Protestantism, with the new Church of England, because he wanted a divorce to marry a new woman. So the country is split between Catholics and Protestants, which is a massive issue. Now we have so many religions here that I don't think we can comprehend just how threatening this split now was in the country. Henry's son becomes king and keeps it Protestant. Then we have Jane keeping it Protestant. Then we have Mary becoming Catholic back. And then Elizabeth bringing Protestants back. Elizabeth I doesn't have children, so she names King James VI of Scotland to become James I of England. He was also a Protestant, so would continue the peace Elizabeth had created. But he becomes king in 1603, and some of the Catholics have had enough. Robert Catesby, Guy Fawkes, and 4 other men were those wanting to do something and willing to do something. They were joined by 7 others at the Duck and Drake Inn in London, and decided to blow up the Houses of Parliament on the state opening day, when the king and all his lords and commons would be there, on the 5th of November 1605. The night before, they put loads of gunpowder below the buildings, and Guy Fawkes was the one to blow it up, to do it. And since he was the first one caught, that's why he's the one we remember, because he was the one doing it, setting it all up, even though he wasn't the sole leader. They caught him in the early hours of the morning because a few days before, an anonymous letter had been sent to Lord Monteagle, telling him not to attend the state opening, and I believe he was a relation to one of the plotters, so that's why they warned him. What about the story of the Titanic? Probably all know that from school or the film as well. It's a tragic story of disaster waiting to happen, showing the impact of the strict social structure of the time and human error when you're overconfident. Even as the ship began sinking at 11:40 p.m, the crew or the captain was just overconfident and didn't immediately start evacuating people. And all those on board were also then just in denial that it was actually going to sink, And the first few lifeboats were sent out half empty because people just weren't getting on. Those in the upper classes, who got to the deck quickest, had more chance of getting on a lifeboat than the lower classes, trapped in their bunks lower down. Because of the way it hit the iceberg, it ended up actually rising, and only one end was underwater, and then it snapped in half, which of course causes chaos, and it's completely underwater by 2:20 a.m. I guess we just find it as a mystery quite intriguing, like seeing the decisions that were made in such a panic. But it did make changes to maritime safety laws, since the largest, newest, most technologically advanced ship to launch in 1912 sank, with only 32% of those on board surviving. Ring of Roses is a nursery rhyme, obviously, but it's based on the plague. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept Europe. You know that. And apparently Ringarosie is talking about the red circle rashes that were the plague symptoms. A pocket full of posies is the people carrying herbs and flowers to ward off the disease because they thought it spread through bad air. A tissue. A sneeze, obviously. And we all fall down. Basically everyone died. It's then sung about the Great Plague of London in 1665 too, so it's being passed down through generations, becoming, like I suppose, some sort of nursery rhymes are like folklore. The British RAF released reports that their pilots ate loads of carrots, which gave them good vision at night during World War II, when actually they had invented radar. So carrots do genuinely have a lot of vitamin A that's good for eye health, but not so much that the myth of them helping you see at night is true. The myth of carrots and vision was massively reinforced by the Ministry of Information in the 1940s. During the Blitz, the German Luftwaffe bombed in the dark, but the RAF managed to get some of them because they had just developed a new radar technology. First used in 1939, their onboard airborne interception radar could pinpoint the enemy planes before they even reached the English Channel. And to try and keep the Germans off of their new technology, the ministry created adverts saying they were just eating carrots. If they believed it, we don't know, but the new radar technology, the blackouts of London, and the fake carrot campaign helped reduce the destruction of the Blitz. The technology was first used by John Cunningham, or Cat Eyes, who was the first to shoot down a German plane using it. And he went on to shoot down 19 of them at night. We then got a list of ancient Egypt's facts. Probably one of the most famous pharaohs, Cleopatra VII, was actually Greek. She descends from Ptolemy I, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals, and whose dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years. They worshipped cats along with 2,000 other gods. Most Egyptian pharaohs were overweight because they had terrible diets. They ate 3 banquets a day, and some of the earliest medical texts written about the dangers of obesity come from 1500 BCE. But apparently they were concerned with their overeating, so the solution was a laxative 3 times a month. They would shave their heads because it was easier than dealing with major lice issues. And they had a 65-day calendar that helped them predict when the Nile was going to flood. The average day for a Viking would probably be farming, fishing, and household chores. They lived in small villages, on the coast of places mostly, growing wheat rather than pillaging most of the time. Apparently they were quite seasonal, making sure there was enough food to eat, but also in their raiding. In summer, men would go across the sea, like to English monasteries, to take the treasure, while the women and children looked after the farms at home. Women would spin wool, make cloth, while children ground the grains for flour and bread. It was supposed to be women doing the work inside the house, and men did the work outside the house. The women cooked, made the clothes, made the drinks, made the dairy products, including milking the animals, and men did all the agriculture work in the fields, like the ploughing, the harvest, although at harvest everyone would have to help. And they lived in long houses with a hearth in the middle, where it was important for the family to gather and share stories with their meals. They were the first Europeans to reach North America and were explorers and traders, not just warriors. Although that's what they did to a lot of other people, so you can see why the image is there. The Tudor dynasty was 6 monarchs: Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Jane Grey, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. They used moss or leaves as toilet paper, and the king had a groom of the stool who wiped his bottom and was his closest, most trusted political advisor. The Tudor period began in 1485, when Henry VII defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, ending the turbulent Wars of the Roses, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York back into one. The Plantagenet line that split, caused the Wars of the Roses, was now brought back because Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. His son Henry took over in 1509. His son Edward took over in 1547. Then his cousin Jane. Then her cousin Edward's sister Mary I in 1533. And then her sister Elizabeth in 1558. The battlefield of Waterloo was looted for teeth of dead soldiers because they were sold to dentists to make dentures. King Tutankhamun's parents were probably siblings, which explains why he was so frail and died so young, but that wasn't an unusual relationship for ancient Egypt. In 1494, Italian sailors coming home from the New World brought back a lot of syphilis from the French army, and they spread the great pox throughout Europe. You could get ulcers on your skin, and your skin would rot away, and people's noses would just dissolve from their face. In the 1800s, tuberculosis, called consumption then, got Connecticut among other American places, but because the illness made you drained and pale, people just assumed you were being drained by a vampire. Not that there was this new disease they just didn't know anything about yet. One family all started dying of consumption, so a vampire hunt began, as people assumed one of the family members must have been feeding off of the rest. So they exhumed the bodies of the mother and the 2 daughters, who were the most recent to die, and the most recent was Mercy Brown. Her body was in the best condition, her heart still had some decay in blood, so she was the vampire. So they burnt her heart and liver. The Roman Empire started 27 BCE, after the fall of the Republic, when Octavian I, Queen Victoria, came to the throne at 18 years old in 1837, and she ruled until 1901. Quite a long period of time. In medieval Britain, eels were used as currency, and someone once rented land for 26,000 eels. Edward III made it law that every Sunday men would partake in archery practice. Golf was actually created in Scotland and was so popular by 1457 that James actually prohibited golf and football because they were too much of a distraction from practicing your archery. Football was banned a few times as well, like in 1314, because Edward II said it was too noisy and might cause evils. Piggy banks started in medieval times because pig, P-Y-G-G, was the type of clay pottery used to make pig jars that were used to store coins. But the phrase piggy bank didn't come about until the 1700s. Marie Antoinette was one of 15 children, but she would only have 4, and 1 would survive to adulthood. She gave birth in view of the public because the king decreed it, and said that all queens or princesses should have to ensure the legitimacy of the child so that no imposter could be brought in. After she had her children, though, her hair lost its oomph, so her hairdresser gave her wigs. She had one that was 4 foot high. They were mostly covered in white flour, and she even started wearing ornaments in her wigs. So, like, when there was a naval victory for France, she had a model ship on her hair. She played the flute, the harp, and the harpsichord, and she met Mozart. But I think he was only 7 at the time. She loved drinking chocolate so much that she had a chocolatier brought from Vienna to Versailles. And after she was executed and dumped in an unmarked open grave, Madame Tussauds sculpted her face, so her death mask is like preserved for history. I think it's the only monarch we really have that of in such good condition, which I think is crazy because I just don't think of Madame Tussauds as being that long ago. And then to end it, my most recent random history video was about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. So, if you've watched this far and you're still awake, please remember to like the video and subscribe. Please. Sorry if the brightness of that woke you up, because I just got too close and reflected the light back at you. So, Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess. She married Arthur, the heir apparent to the English throne, but he sadly died. So she remarried the next person in line, Henry, who would become King Henry VIII. She became the first female European ambassador in history in 1507, becoming the ambassador of the Aragonite crown to England. She served as regent for 6 months while Henry was in France, overseeing English victory in Scotland, but she also had a stillborn child. She would have multiple, as well as miscarriages, and she did actually give Henry his first son, but he sadly died at 52 days old. Her only surviving child would become Mary I. Anne Boleyn served as one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting from 1526, and Henry had already had her sister Mary as a mistress, but she refused to be a mistress and was made Marquisate of Pembroke before they got married. She also suffered many miscarriages, and her only child would be Elizabeth I. She was executed for adultery, incest and treason, along with the 5 men she supposedly had affairs with, including her brother. Jane Seymour gave Henry the son he wanted, and had served as lady-in-waiting to Anne, who she also shared a great-grandmother with, as did Catherine Howard. She was supposedly very good at peacemaking in court, being gentle compared to the previous women. She made Henry reconcile with his first daughter Mary, who would act as chief mourner at her funeral. She was the only one given a queen's funeral, and is who Henry was buried with. Anne of Cleves married Henry 6 years after Jane died, but only lasted 6 months. Henry blamed her appearance, but they did actually remain friends. So one could argue she got the best result out of everyone. Because she just accepted the annulment, Henry was pleased and made her an honorary member of his family as the king's beloved sister, who had Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, which had previously belonged to the Boleyns. She outlived all the wives and Henry, and is the only one buried in Westminster Abbey. Catherine Howard had a pretty turbulent and nasty life in regards to SA. She went to serve as Anne's lady-in-waiting because her uncle knew that Henry was divorcing Anne and that he'd need a new wife. A year into their marriage, she was alleged to be having affairs, so the Archbishop of Canterbury investigated, and because she maintained that her previous relationships had been non-consensual, which is why she hadn't told the king, that's why she's executed, because in 1541 there's the Royal Assent by Commission Act that meant it was treason not to disclose a previous relationship when marrying a monarch. And then Catherine Parr, who outlived Henry but only by a year. She's the most married English queen because she married before once, then to Henry, and then after to Thomas Seymour. Elizabeth then actually lived with them, and Thomas Seymour made advances to Elizabeth. She was the first Queen of England and Ireland, and she's the first English Queen to write and publish a book under her own name in 1545 called Prayers and Meditations. So, with the first female published in history, in England history, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you sleep well, if you're asleep. If you're not asleep, sorry this didn't help. If you weren't watching for sleep at all, sorry if I spoke too slowly or quietly. I do hope you enjoyed. Please do like the video and subscribe if you did. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.